south of the border, down Mexico way. That's where I fell in love when the stars above came out to play. And now as I wander...
Hello there, all you expat wannabes. I'm Johnny Mueller, and you're listening to the Expat Files, Living in Latin America, the show that tells you just what it's like to live, work, play, and or retire down here in Latin America. It's a mix of the good, the bad, the ugly, and the great, and it's all right here, so let's get started. Talk about how you can manipulate and lie with statistics. How about this? According to the U.S. CIA, that Central Intelligence Agency's World Fact Book. Say what? A CIA fact book? Didn't even know they had one, as if the CIA deals in facts. I always thought they made them up as they went along. Anyway, they say Cuba. Let's talk about Cuba for a minute. Their export goods and services, that is what they sell to the world, represent $1.9 billion worth of goods. In other words, what they export and they receive in U.S. dollars or euros, whatever, some kind of internationally convertible currency, not like their peso. Grand total, $1.9 billion in currency they receive from what they sell. And if you break that down, for each of Cuba's 12 million people, $170 per person. You got that? $170 per person based on what they export. Whereas in first world countries, even in other Latin American countries, you're talking about thousands of dollars per person earned from the products and services they export. So what, you might say? Well, here's where it gets extremely interesting and what probably only 1 in 10,000 people has ever heard before. According to the CIA World Fact Book, the following are the top 10 things that Cuba exports to the rest of the world. We're talking legal exports anyway. And this is from the number 1 moneymaker to the number 10 moneymaker. Number 1, sugar, $556 million. That's around $500 million. We're talking per year now. Number 2, tobacco, around $250 million. That's $250 million. Then you've got nickel, $140 million. Beverages, spirits, wine, rum, $120 million per year, that is. Fish and fish products, $89 million. Mineral fuels, including oil, $71 million. Did you know Cuba is an oil-producing country? But you didn't know that either. Anyway, number 7, iron and steel, $46 million a year. Wood and wood products, $43 million a year. Pharmaceuticals, $42 million a year. And number 10, copper, $25 million a year. Sounds like just a bunch of boring statistics, right? Well, just wait. All right, so there's the top 10, according to the CIA fact book, representing, as mentioned, around $1.9 billion a year. But here's what you didn't know. That list is all wrong. It's a complete lie. Because you see, Cuba's got one other particular legal export that brings in, get this, 20 times the dough. 20 times. Then the number 1 export on that list, which is sugar. No, we're not talking about tourism here. That's a different thing. We're talking about exported items. Tourism is not exported. In fact, their real number 1 export brings in 5 times the dough than every other Cuban export combined. So why is it not on that list? Because it's not a good PR or marketing move, as you'll see. Have you guessed it yet? It's medical doctors. And you know what? We wouldn't even be talking about this right now if it wasn't for a crazy thing that just happened in Brazil. So, Brazil, as you may or may not know, just elected a new president. He's a right-leaning president, they say, anti-communist and somewhat anti-socialist. Here's what happened. Something no one expected. Listen to this. The new president, his name is Bolsonaro, took office on January 1st, 2019, just about a month ago. And in one of his first official acts, he decided to kick out all the Cuban doctors that were practicing in Brazil. Now, you might be thinking, big deal, how many Cuban doctors could there be in Brazil? How about 11,000? That's right, 11,000 Cuban doctors under contract practicing in Brazil. That is until last month when they were all unceremoniously kicked out. All right, let me read a few excerpts now from Brazil's biggest daily newspaper. Translated, of course, not by me because I don't speak Portuguese, but someone did it. The title is, President Bolsonaro rejects Cuban doctors working as slaves. It says one of President Bolsonaro's first acts is to refuse to allow Cuban medical doctors to work in Brazil for slave wages. since the Cuban dictatorship keeps the vast part of their earnings. In fact, slavery is the exact word used by the new Brazilian president. He uses slavery to describe the working conditions of Cuban doctors in Brazil, given that the Cuban state keeps more than 75% of their salary. In response, the indignant Cuban government ordered the repatriation of the 11,000 doctors, but in the meantime, they made a deal with another Latin country to absorb most of them. Guess what country? Mexico! So how did Mexico make that deal so fast, since nothing moves quickly in Latin America? Well, it turns out Lázaro Cárdenas Pastel, chief advisor and confidant to Mexico's new president, negotiated the deal in less than a month. So the question is, how did he get through the back door so fast? How did he cut through all that red tape and get such access? Well, as it turns out, 14 years ago, Pastel, the chief advisor to Mexico's new president, the guy who put together the doctor swap, lived in Cuba and studied at the Higher Institute of Art in Havana and is married to a Cuban national. That's reason number 2,647 why I'd certainly never want to live in Mexico. But the plot thickens. Listen to this. According to this new deal, where at least 3,000 of the 11,000 doctors kicked out of Brazil ended up in Mexico just a month ago in December, it says the Mexican government will pay $6.5 million a month to the Castro dictatorship, amounting to a total of $80 million a year, which works out to around $2,100 a month for each doctor, which is even less than they were getting in Brazil. Turns out after the Castro government gets their share, they'll be paying the docs $700 a month. 2/3 of the dough to the Castro government, 1/3 of the dough to the doc, which is a $200 a month haircut from what they were getting in Brazil. Then it says the first 3,000 Cuban doctors have arrived and are settling in. Oh, and get this. Their distinctive feature is that they have to be married heads of household, and their wives or husbands and families must remain in Cuba. That's how you get to be an exported Cuban doctor. Anyway, it says, the negotiation is a part of at least 8,000 doctors arriving in Mexico from Cuba. Then it says, as an aside, there's a sinister aspect to it all, too. There have been many instances where Cuban doctors who have not gone back have admitted that they've been asked to or forced to fulfill the dual function of being an agent for the Cuban government. Meaning some of them have been trained in espionage and foreign indoctrination, although no one really knows the numbers or if the Cuban doctors are even playing along with the strategy. It's just to say that it is true. Some Cuban doctors are trained to be instruments of Cuban expansion, especially since their wives, husbands, and families must remain back in Cuba while the doctors are farmed out internationally. Now get this, according to the Brazilian government, they've been paying $3,500 a month to the Cuban dictatorship for each of the 11,000 doctors in their country. And of that $3,500, each Cuban doctor receives $900 a month, or slightly under 11,000 US dollars a year. That's about 1/20th of the average medical doctor's salary up in the States and in the rest of the first world. Then it says, meanwhile, according to the Cuban docs, the biggest hardship of all is that they're forced to leave their loved ones back in Cuba for long periods of time. And if, when their contract is up, they decide to skip out, they'll never be allowed back in Cuba again, and their family will never be allowed travel visas to leave Cuba. So accordingly, new Brazilian President Bolsonaro called those actions human rights violations and proposed a new contract and new set of conditions, beginning with giving full salary directly to the doctors, as well as allowing them to bring their families and request political asylum if they so desire after the contract is up. But as expected, the Castro regime would agree to none of it. Then it says the Cuban doctor program, their number one foreign income earner by far, is called the Más Médicos program. That means the More Doctor program in English. And wouldn't you know it, it's going great guns and at full blast in 66 different countries. And why not? It's a great deal for any government since the doctors come so cheap. And right now, there are a total of 55,000 doctors in those 66 countries. And it says the Cuban dictatorship pockets $11.5 billion a year for the program, which even dwarfs the amount of money Cuba receives from tourism. In fact, the government receives 4 times as much from their doctor program than from all the tourism on the island. Oh, and just a little background on this guy, Cardenas Batel. He's the new Mexican president's chief advisor with the Cuban wife and who went to university in Havana. It says when he was governor of Michoacan from 2002 to 2008, he hired 400 Cuban advisors, had them shipped to Michoacan, installed them in various Mexican government positions. All right, so that's what you didn't know about the Cuban doctor exchange program. Meanwhile, the whole world's under the impression that the Castro regime has created this sort of tremendous philanthropic do-gooder angel of mercy doctor program, shipping highly trained young doctors to the 4 corners of the earth as selfless goodwill medical emissaries. Well, you have to admit it's great PR, all right. It certainly paints a nice, happy, humanistic face on socialism, doesn't it? But in reality, it's all about capitalism. It's Cuba's #1 moneymaker by far. Which is why you really have to give kudos to Brazil's new president for having the huevos to expose the scam he's calling medical slavery, especially since his country was greatly benefiting from it. Oh, and speaking of Cuban doctors, I bet you never met one. How could you? They're not permitted to practice up in the States. Well, I met quite a few. I met one that's a professor, too. Teaches physiology at a medical school in Panama. And he told me there are so many Cuban doctors all over the world, especially in Latin America, that they kind of stick together and hang together. They're kind of considered outsiders by the rest of the hospital staffs and other doctors. He said one of the main topics of discussion when they get together is how to work it so they don't have to go back, or how they can work it to get their families out of Cuba permanently. He told me he knows a few doctors who skipped after their contract was up. In other words, they become illegal aliens in the country they were assigned to, and then they apply for asylum and usually get it. And though it's true they're barred from ever going back to Cuba, and their families in Cuba barred from traveling abroad, some take that risk and skip anyway. Oh, and here's something else the doc told me that's quite interesting. He said there's another Cuban personnel export program going on that almost no one knows about. He said the Cuban government has around 10,000 sports trainers at various schools and universities around the world, operating under the same sort of exchange deal. In fact, he said if you check out any Latin university, and there are over 5,000 of them, you'll find that nearly all of them have one or more Cuban sports coaches and fitness trainers. But that's not all. The doc also told me the Cuban government contracts out professional musicians, merengue, and salsa bands, mostly to big hotel chains like the Clarion, Hyatt, Hilton, Intercontinental, etc. So next time you're staying at one of those nice 3 or 4-star hotels, not in the U.S., of course, and you see there's a really slick salsa or merengue band playing nightly in the lounge, there's a very good chance they're on contract from the Cuban government also making slave wages. Though they do have the advantage of free room and board at a very nice hotel. All right, time to take a left turn into the gutter. Remember a couple of shows ago I was talking about stinky people at airports and getting stuck next to people that are potentially repulsive. Though maybe they're thinking the same thing about me. Who knows? So anyway, on the heels of that, now comes this story. It's about how, just last week, American Airlines booted a family of 3 from their flight home to Detroit after many other passengers complained about the group's body odor. Yes, sir, it says, last Wednesday evening, Yossi and Jenny Adler and their 19-month-old daughter were told to get off the plane from Miami to Detroit while they were in the midst of boarding. Turns out, Yossi Adler, the odoriferous guy they kicked off, said, "I don't get it. All of a sudden, they closed the gate on us and said, 'Sorry, sir. Some people are complaining about your body odor.'" All right, me, Johnny, here. What do I think about that? Listen, after you've paid $400, $500, $600, even $1,000, are you supposed to tolerate a stink-induced migraine? I don't think so. Or maybe, as one emailer suggests, got a lot of emails when I spoke about that last time, he said they should have a no stinking section on the plane. However, if that were even possible, who's to judge? It couldn't be a human. It'd have to be an electronic instrument of some sort. Because normally when people stink as their natural state, they don't know it. Think about garlic lovers for a second.
All right, now here's some news you should pay attention to. Occasionally I get emails from people saying, Johnny, you never talk about Chile.
What's up with that? Do you recommend it or not? Well, for some people, what it's got going for it is the four seasons and lots of beachfront. It's a long, skinny country, around 2,600 miles from north to south. So if you want nice, decent spring-like weather all the time, you have to stay way in the north. The thing is, most of the people listening to this show would like to learn how to live fairly cheap on, let's say, a Social Security check of $1,500 a month. Well, in Chile, that would be difficult because it is expensive. And as a rule, if you want to live like a first world American, almost anywhere in South America is going to be more expensive than in Central America. Lots of reasons for that. You heard me talk about many of them on the show. Just, for example, be prepared to pay up to twice the price for electronics, electrical appliances, and cars. One of the other reasons, of course, is you'll have air conditioning and heating expenses. But what about Chile? You've heard me say many times that Latin Americans don't give a rip about privacy. They'll give their personal dats up on a platter to any pop-up window that offers them a free slice of pizza. Seems like they have no idea how dangerous that can be until the moment comes when they get their ID or credit card numbers stolen, or faked, or cloned. That's why you see here in Latin papers and media just countless instances of ID theft, credit card fraud, etc. As, for example, with this story coming directly out of Chile. And you thought this stuff only happened up in the first world. The article entitled, Hackers Access 14,000 Chilean Credit Card Accounts and Publish the Data on the Internet. It says this week there was a massive leak after hackers gained access to 14,000 credit card numbers. They'd published the credit card numbers, expiration dates, and security codes right online. Then it says, although the attack was mainly aimed at the Bank of Chile, there were at least 12 other entities involved, including BCI, Falabella, Santander, and Banco Estado Bank. Then it says, in a brief statement, Banco de Chile said that our security protocols have blocked these cards in a preventative manner. What the hell else are they going to say? In a preventative manner? How come you couldn't prevent the attack, you idiots? Then it says Chile's Superintendency of Banks and Financial Institutions, SBIF, said the hack was carried out by a mysterious group of hackers called the Shadow Brokers, known for hacking the supposedly unhackable NSA in the U.S. in 2016. And here we all thought the NSA was supposed to be the hacker, not the hackee. Then it says, get this, the hack was discovered after publication of the data on social network Twitter. Then it says, the hack was tracked down to Eastern Europe and Asia, with millions ending up in Hong Kong banks. But that's not all. In June of 2018, Banco de Chile, the biggest in the country, said that hackers robbed it of $10 million and the funds were never recovered. By the way, my brother's best friend is a high-end banker in Chicago. And he told me not so long ago that when you hear about hacks on banks in the news, that's only about 5% of the money that's really hacked or stolen. Banks do not like to publicize that stuff. It makes them look bad and they don't want to panic the customers. And he said if you hear a certain number when they talk about funds being hacked or stolen in the news, you can bet it's really double or triple that figure or even more. Now, you see, we got to talking about this during a Bitcoin discussion. The discussion was specifically about how much Bitcoin has been stolen or hacked out of wallets since it's been in existence for 10 years now. He laughed and said, don't you see, that's the plan. For bankers to undermine the prestige of Bitcoin and the other cryptos by saying wallets are insecure and the coins are getting stolen all the time. For bankers, that's the standard line because cryptocurrencies are a big threat to the traditional banking system. He said what the public doesn't know is that the banking system's hacked all the time for millions, even billions a month. The big banking hacks are never reported, but we're glad to pass on information about Bitcoin hacks. He said the public would just freak out if they knew how much was being hacked every month out of their own banks. Meanwhile, he said you'll hear all about the Bitcoin and crypto heists, because that's the name of the game when undermining consumer confidence in investing and using cryptos. He said someday people will find out the real truth of the massive hacks that have gone down and continue to go down and the fragility of the traditional banking system.
though he hopes it doesn't happen till well after he's retired. The problem, he says, is that the hackers are always a step or two ahead of what they've got for banking cybersecurity. So they're always chasing their tails. They get hacked, funds get stolen, they fix the hack, they get hacked again, funds get stolen, they fix that hack. You get it. Does that scare you? It should. All right, enough said about that. Speaking of Catholic countries, were we speaking about those? Glad you brought it up. You know, I was brought up Catholic, went to Catholic school and all that. We all kind of knew there were some twisted padres out there. In fact, my brother has his own story. He told me that when he was around 12 or 13, one of the fathers took him and a bunch of kids camping. That's pretty common, actually. Nothing wrong with the young priest bonding with a bunch of teenagers he knows just might get in trouble if he doesn't lead them down the right path. That's what priests are supposed to do, right? By the way, stop me if I told this story already, okay? Hey, when I was 12 or 13, one of the young padres, you know, they're usually really young, 20, 21, 22, right out of the seminary. You know, they're all pumped up with all that goodness and energy, trying to save the world and all that. He did the same thing, took a bunch of us young guys camping a couple of times, tried to be a good influence and all that. He was a good guy, too. However, my brother tells a different story of another padre who molested two of his buddies in a tent, though they didn't talk about it for years later. By the way, when my brother and his buddies were in their late 30s, they showed me a little article in the newspaper where this guy, this scumbag priest, was caught and was finally being brought up on charges only 25 years too late. So as far as priests and molestations up in the first world, the Pandora's box has been opened. Millions, if not billions, have been paid out by the Catholic Church in reparations and all that. Priests have gone to jail. There have been documentaries on the abuse, the Pope covering up things for years and years. You've heard the stories. Meanwhile, here in Latin America, there are even more Catholics and more devout hypocrites. Hey, we all know the Latin macho guy playbook. He's got a wife, a girlfriend on the side, maybe two. That's during the week, but Sundays exclusively for the family. Church too. And you know, up till about a year or so ago, there have been very few publicized cases of Catholic priests here molesting young boys, although it's an epidemic. So it took a while, big lag time, but the Pandora's box has been opened down here too. Turns out every single Latin country has had its Catholic priest sex scandal, or 2 or 10 or 20. And you do read about it in the newspapers, but it's almost never covered on the TV news shows. Isn't that weird? And just like it was 10, 15, 20 years ago up in the States, it's not a topic you want to bring up for general conversation at the dinner table, and especially prohibited at a Catholic dinner table. It's just too embarrassing and delicate a topic for mom, pop, grandma, and grandpa. They still don't believe it or deny it altogether. It just seems inconceivable. By the way, that's exactly what happened 30 years ago when I tried to have that discussion with my own Catholic mother. She didn't want to hear about it. But we're talking about Latin America, and the floodgates have been opened. Here's a perfect example. Listen to this. The title of this article, Ecuador's National Assembly revokes honor to Cuenca priest accused of sexual abuse. All right, big deal, you're thinking, not much of a headline. You see, they don't want to tell you right up front, but they do later in the article. Now, listen to the rest. Ecuador's National Assembly has revoked an educational award to Cuenca priest Cesar Cordero. Cordero is the founder of Cuenca's Catholic University and the annual Paz del Niño celebration. In English, a celebration of children. Ain't that nice? Turns out 6 former students have come forward and accused him of sexual assault, and prosecutors say he's guilty of dozens more abuses. Man, does it get worse. Cordero, who is 91 now and in poor health, received the Assembly's Vicente Rocafort Award in 2010 for lifetime achievement for his work in the education of Ecuadorian children. You know, that would be funny if it wasn't so pathetic. It says, born into one of Cuenca, Ecuador's most prominent families, his grandfather was president of Ecuador, and later its poet laureate. And the current Cuenca mayor is his close relative. Cordero helped build more than a dozen primary schools throughout Ecuador. Man, he had a thing for kids, huh? He's also credited with founding hospitals, clinics, religious radio and television stations, and several Catholic charities. He's earned PhDs in Lima, Paris, and did postdoctoral work in the U.S. In addition to Spanish, he is fluent in 5 languages. Among his many lifetime honors are grants of citizenship in Italy, Moldova, and by way of the U.S. state of Arkansas. Shades of that scumbag Bill Clinton, huh? It goes on to say the official accusations of sexual abuse began last year, with one accuser calling Cordero a sexual monster who has ruined the lives of many young men in Cuenca. You know what I say? A bullet is too good for that guy. He needs to be hung in the public square. At least when you hang a guy, you can use the rope over and over again. It's recyclable. Don't even have to pay 50 cents for a bullet. Oh, and you know, in junior high school and high school, I had a buddy who ended up going to DeSales Seminary in Milwaukee, Wisconsin to become a priest. He went there a couple of years, didn't finish, quit, and became a funeral director. Anyway, I lost track of the guy till my 10th year high school reunion, and to everyone's surprise, he'd come out of the closet. He was one of those gay guys that was totally masculine, showed no signs of it in high school, had girlfriends and all that, but, you know, things happen, no big deal. He's a great guy. Anyway, we sat down, got to talking about old times, and he told me at the seminary there were actually two different factions, two camps. One camp, all gay guys, and the other camp, all straight guys, and they didn't mix much. He also said it was kind of a gay man's paradise. Now, I'm only telling you what he said to me, but it was firsthand from a guy who actually attended a Catholic seminary. When I asked him to estimate how many of those guys he thought would violate their vows of celibacy after becoming priests, he said he was sure at least 20% would screw around, whether gay or straight. So there's a little info right from the horse's mouth. Though I have to say in defense of the Catholics, I really did get a great education at Catholic schools. And the nuns really did whoop my ass regularly. No harm done. You just have to be aware that there are a lot of pervert priests out there. But the problem is rarely, when they get caught, do they get their comeuppance. They usually get shipped around to other parishes where they do more damage or get psychiatric treatment, which doesn't help. However, here in Latin America, it's a completely different story. And I know you've heard me say this many times before, especially in small and middle-sized towns. The locals, the men and women on the street, often take the law into their own hands. What I can see for some of these abusers of the cloth is a lot of whippings and stonings in the Central Park. All right, just one more thing before we close out for the day. There's been a lot of interest in my Latin American healthcare report, subtitled First World Healthcare at Third World Prices. If you want to know the current state of healthcare in Latin America and how to find those first world doctors, clinics, and hospitals, and find out all about those amazingly cheap insurance plans, just go to theexpatfiles.com/healthcare and pick up my 100-page report.
You've been listening to the Expat Files, Living in Latin America. If you need some help with your own Plan B, you can schedule a one-on-one phone call with me. But first, download my free Plan B questionnaire at www.thenewexpat.com. Better yet, if you want to get your Plan B going from right up there in the States, just sign up for my 9-hour Expat Essentials course. Get the perfect Plan B blueprint by going to theexpatfiles.com/academy. Nos vemos.